Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And we are looking forward to a very interesting conversation here on what impact the internet, the online space, has on politics. Now, I want to start by giving some of you a sense of the Indian context. Still, I would say maybe even a year ago, or maybe a couple of years ago, definitely, politicians who were actually dabbling with offering comments in the online space were regarded as political risk takers. To dabble in the online space was seen as some sort of new age kind of habit that didn't really go down well with a political tradition that has not kept pace with the changing times. Yet today we see a definitive change. We see more and more politicians embracing the online world. We see online forums actually used as modern-day versions of wire agencies. I will tell you this as a journalist, that now most politicians are making their most critical announcements online, whether they use Google, whether they use Twitter, whether they have Facebook pages. From Mamta Banerjee to the politicians we have sitting here on the panel today, Shashi, Tharoor and Omar, Abdullah, you're seeing big-ticket announcements being made online. Have our politicians actually finally understood the power of the online space? Does the internet have the capacity to impact and change political outcomes in India? How does it compare with other models around the world? That's what we're going to be looking at in our conversation today. I want to introduce now our panelists today as we ask whether the internet has the power to change politics in India. Shashi Tharoor, minister in the government, one of the earliest to take to the online space, was regarded as somewhat of an oddity when he began, and now everybody's really emulating his example, really led the way at a time when this was regarded as a kind of new agey, weird thing to do. With us from the United States of America, Stephanie Cutter, somebody who's actually been the architect of the election campaign for Barack Obama this time around, for Michelle Obama earlier. Remember, you come from a country where there's almost 80% internet penetration. Compare that to under 12% for India. Can these models be compared? We know that social media is a huge, huge thing in the campaigns in the United States of America. And finally, Omar Abdullah, Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, somebody who is active online, has not always enjoyed it, but has argued that I will not be driven off by the organized venom online. And that is something that we also have to look at in the conversation today on the kinds of voices that get amplified in the online space. Before I come to the Indian perspective, Stephanie Cutter, if I may start with you. We have, of course, seen American election campaigns take the online space very seriously. In India, we grapple with the question that the online space is very loud, it's very voluble, it's very assertive, but these are not necessarily the people who go out and vote. We don't know that yet. We don't know that they don't, and we don't know that they do, because this is new for us. What have been the findings in your experience when you build a campaign? What is it that you had to keep in mind when it came to the online world and the internet space?
Well, in the United States, it's been an evolution. You know, the first presidential election that really had to grapple with the internet was in 2004 between President Bush and John Kerry. Back then, the internet was largely a fundraising tool. And with the rise of bloggers back then, you know, now that's so commonplace, but back then it was new, which was like an online forum for people to express their views. You know, in 2004, we took it seriously. We didn't take it that seriously. Did it impact that election? It probably drove news stories, but it didn't impact how people were going to vote. In 2008, when then Senator Obama was starting to run for the presidency, we saw a dramatic growth in the number of people who were using the internet to get information on candidates, to organize themselves. Not from the campaign top down, it was coming from the bottom up. And that was only possible because of the internet. It was an organizing tool for people to get involved in their local elections and to organize for national elections. Now, in 2012, it exploded. We made a big investment in developing new tools and techniques of how to use the internet in this election, and develop some new technologies that allowed us to do three things. One, communicate in a very aggressive fashion outside of the media filter. Number two, fundraise. The overwhelming majority of our money came from the internet. Average donation was about $150. And number 3, organize. This was the first campaign where we were able to connect what was happening online with what was happening offline. So if we had people going door to door to canvass for the president, they had tools right there on their mobile device or their iPad and knew whose door they were knocking on, what that person was interested, how they voted in the past. And it was real-time information that got uploaded, and we were able to fairly accurately predict votes in specific neighborhoods going up to election day.
Would it be fair to say that someone who was not using the internet space in the US would be regarded as a fuddy-duddy, antediluvian
Well, it's
politician?
not possible anymore.
It's not possible.
Even the oldest politicians, whether in the United States Senate or Congress or somebody running for town council, I guarantee you they have a Facebook page, they tweet, they have a home page where you can go and sign up for events or learn more about that person. It's just not possible to run for elected office without the internet in the United States now.
So I want to take that to you, Shashi, because when you tumbled into the online space, you found yourself in the middle of really unnecessary controversies, and yet what you were actually battling was a political culture that is at the best of times not communicative enough. That's my opinion. Maybe you can't say that freely, but that is something that your party is sometimes accused of, and other parties are too, that there isn't just the culture of communication and openness. How much has changed? How much has changed since you got into trouble for an innocuous little tweet on cattle class to now when everybody is actually falling over themselves to join the internet space?
Well, it's very interesting actually, Barkha, because when I began, the political class was not immediately resistant. For example, when there was one of the newspapers announced that I had crossed 10,000 followers, I actually had a number of very senior politicians from my own party, and I won't even mention how senior, you'll be shocked, asking me, what is this Twitter? How do you get 10,000 followers? How should we do it, etc. It was the visceral reaction of our mainstream media, however, in going after me, in using my presence on social media to attack me.
So social media was kinder to you than mainstream media, or fairer to you?
At that point, social media was, frankly, I was in that space and nobody else was. So kindness didn't really apply, but the fact that the mainstream media decided to use anything I said on social media to attack me meant that all the other politicians shrunk away. And the very people who'd asked me said, Abdullah, we're not going to touch this. This is clearly too dangerous for us to go in. Thereafter, of course, the controversies kept mounting, as did the followers, but people stayed away. I still remember the then president of the BJP, Venkaiah Naidu, saying, as it turned out prophetically, too much tweeting can lead to quitting. Do you remember that? That was sort of that was the attitude by then of the political class, and frankly, who wanted to buck the mainstream media, which is what you want to deal with. But in my case, it actually redoubled my determination, because I realized that I had to get past this negative filter in the mainstream media to talk to people directly, who knew what I was trying to say and could relate to me, even if they weren't in the political space. Fortunately, all that has changed. For the reasons that Stephanie's mentioned, people have become aware they can't afford to give this a miss.
But have we reached that point where Indian politicians can't afford to neglect the online space? Have we reached that point?
Just two things. I mean, in late 2009, I gave an interview saying, and at the time when I was when even well-meaning friends were coming to me saying, you've proved your point, now give up Twitter and so on. I gave an interview saying, look, for God's sake, within 10 years, I said every serious Indian politician will be on social media. And I think the 10 years now turns out to be far too late a prediction, because already the majority of major politicians, including ministers of the government and opposition leaders, including the gentleman who's going to follow us on the stage, they are all on Twitter.
Narendra Modi.
Yes. Exactly. So what you've got, in other words, is a widespread consensus that it's necessary. However, you're totally right. With 12% internet penetration, none of us expects a Twitter account or a Facebook page to win us an election, because none of us will have a majority of our voters, not even Bombay South, Million's constituency, whatever, will have a majority of voters on the internet. So why do we use Twitter? Well, first of all, it gives us an extraordinary interactive medium. We can actually answer questions from ordinary strangers, not just from very visible television anchors. We can respond to the concerns of the Aam Aadmi, as it were, on this space. And at the same time, we can get our messages out without you all editing it or misreporting it, which still continues to happen extensively. The third thing, which I believe has turned out to be very important for the gentleman whose name we mentioned, is the brand building aspect. That you use
the one who cannot be mentioned.
You know, I no doubt will come around to it eventually. But my point was that you actually have the idea of using your presence on the social space to create a sort of brand identity for yourself, which is actually not directly linked to the votes you may or may not win, but which will undoubtedly have an indirect ripple effect. Because the people who are on the internet, it is hoped, will talk to and influence and shape the agenda of others. And finally, you guys in the traditional media have stopped this antagonistic relationship to those of us on social media. You are now mining the social media for news stories.
Yeah.
Actually, things we say on social media are becoming news. You're quoting us. You yourself, Barkha, are very much on social media in a very prominent way. And so that brief antagonism that I witnessed in my first year on social media, I think has now more or less faded. Therefore, it's no longer a problem with the mainstream media. All of these factors, I think.
So it's not a problem, Omar, but is it useful? And I think what Shashi is alluding to is a wider public narrative and also an effective means of just getting your message out in one fell swoop. You put it on Twitter and everybody picks it up. I want to ask you that someone like you, according to me, probably has amongst the toughest jobs in the country today. You're the chief minister of really one of the most difficult, complex states. You have seen in the past few weeks a very volatile time, and you have chosen on occasion to use a platform like Twitter to say what you have to, whether it's calling out to what you perceive to be a doublespeak in how grief expresses itself in the valley, whether it's to tell the opposition I'm not resigning, and so on. But you have at other times also spoken about how insanely provocative the negativity can get online. And you've said, hang on, I'm not going to be bullied off this space, and that's part of the reason I'm here. What keeps you online?
I think the advantages of social media far outweigh the disadvantages. As long as you can develop a thick enough skin to read your timeline and to digest the barrage of abuse that gets heaped on you, you can survive it. Every once in a while, I need to take a break.
Yeah.
When things get particularly bad in the state, I step back from social media because, quite honestly, I just can't deal with the distraction. But in terms of the opportunity it affords me to get a point of view across in the shortest possible span of time, it is irreplaceable. There is nothing that I say on Twitter, rightly or wrongly, that doesn't get picked up in a matter of seconds. I mean, if there is a rumor going around that needs to be corrected, by the time I get my information department to type out a press note, verify the contents of it, then put it out, the story is already too old.
Yeah.
140 characters on Twitter, and I can be rest assured that TV channels will have it on their ticker within seconds. So my job is done.
So the loser in this whole story is really the traditional media, right?
Look, I don't...
You've jumped on the bandwagon now.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys are following everyone on Twitter who's worth following to see what they say.
Yeah.
And whatever we do say gets picked up and used as
But can
news.
I ask you that the immediacy is obviously a great plus, but is it a downside sometimes for politicians if both of you will speak to this? Because sometimes, and this has happened to me, you say something and then you bite your tongue because you've got into a scrap online.
That's happened to me as well.
Yeah.
But I have an advantage that Shashi doesn't.
Which is?
I belong to a regional party. I'm pretty high up the pecking order, and therefore I'm unlikely to get into trouble for saying things. Unlike Shashi, unfortunately. While his party talks about using social media, when he does say something, it's the same party that turns and says, no, these views should be expressed internally. They should not be shared with everybody else. He needs to learn when to keep quiet. So he has a slightly bigger problem than I do.
Before I get Stephanie in on that, anything you said on Twitter and then you bit your tongue?
But actually, I was thinking of a famous example involving Omar, which is about a year and a half ago, I think. Omar said something on Twitter. I still don't know what it was. And a bunch of well-meaning friends immediately said, Omar, take that off. It's going to be misquoted. You're going to get in trouble. Omar promptly deleted that tweet, so that to this day, the advice to delete can be found on Twitter, but not the offending tweet itself. So clearly, he's done something quickly enough. Whereas in my case, usually, I tweet on the car between appointments and things like that. So if I make a boo-boo, however many people advise me to correct it, by the time I read their advice, it's too late because it's already all over the place. But yes, no, I do, of course. I mean, I think the cattle class one is the classic one that I do wish, when this BJP leading journalist asked me, Mr. Minister, will you travel cattle class? you know, I'd been back a few months. It was an expression I'd heard for 30 years in the West. And I assumed that everybody in India using English would also know that what cattle class meant, that it was, in any case, not derogatory about passenger, but derogatory about airlines for herding us in like cattle. So I replied with my sort of not always effective sense of humor that, I will travel cattle class in solidarity with all our holy cows. Well, as you know, I then went off to Liberia, completely out of range, and the proverbial dung hit the fan, with the result that for 2 days, the media, my party, the entire political establishment were denouncing me, calling for my resignation, and I was in Liberia trying to negotiate for the government, blissfully unaware of all of this. It wasn't a happy episode. But having said that, there's some deliberate malice. There were some people who twisted the story, who knew perfectly well or could have looked up what cattle class meant, to reduce it to a caricature, that this is a fellow who thinks ordinary economy class travelers are cattle, was, I think, not particularly pleasantly motivated. And the other aspect of all of this, of course, is that because it was out there in this very narrow medium, it was the negatives got magnified and got magnified in translation. So when you hear cattle class in Hindi or Malayalam or Gujarati, it becomes a different story.
The idiom changes.
I will still lose votes because of that expression. There are still
You would lose votes.
I'm still losing. There are still people in my constituency who were persuaded at the time by the media that I think that I disdain them all as cattle. And that therefore, I mean, I've actually had staff members overhearing conversations, people who admire what I've done for the constituency, but say, how can we vote for a guy who thinks we're cattle? So it has caused me damage, and therefore I'll never do it again. I do regret having done it. You know, Shakespeare had that great line, that the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. So what we have to do on Twitter and any other social media is figure out not what we intend to say when we're saying something, but how it might be heard, including by not particularly well-intentioned people.
Stephanie, speak to the potential of the gaffe online and what kind of ripple effect it can have, and how mindful do American politicians have to be of that, and how you deal with immense negativity. Let's take, for example, Barack Obama's first debate, before, you know, which was panned by everybody, saying, what the hell happened to Obama? Did he just lose his mojo, right? When something like that happens, when you're being panned online, somebody like you, whose job it is to change the narrative, whether online or offline, what do you do? Well,
I'm not sure if everybody had seen that first debate, but there wasn't much we could have done. You know, I think, you know, I will say that normally in presidential debates in the United States, we have what's called a spin room after, which is where you spin your story when the debate has ended. With the emergence of online media and online communications tools, you can't wait to post-debate spin room to figure out what the storyline is. It's almost immediate as soon as the debate starts. And you know, it wasn't hard to tell that we were losing that debate, but 15 minutes into it, if you watched the Twitter conversation and what was trending, it was very clear that we were going to lose the debate, and there was very little that we could do to change the course of that in the middle of the debate. So that is an example of things, you know, that was a bit of reality meeting the online world. There wasn't much we could do to turn that around. What I did after the debate is to figure out how we were going to change the conversation. And you know, we stayed up all night writing a speech, cutting an ad, organizing people on the ground, and the president gave a speech the next morning showing that he did have mojo, that he was going to hit back, and taking a key line from that debate. Everybody know what Big Bird is?
Yeah. Sesame Street.
Sesame Street. Mitt Romney used an example of how he was going to cut the deficit by cutting out funding for Big Bird, which symbolized for us the difference in the campaign, where the president was willing to take on big challenges, Mitt Romney was going to take on Big Bird. So the next day, we just tried to change the conversation. But the role of the internet and online conversation, it is a bit uncontrollable. And you have to learn how to deal with that when you're planning campaigns, trying to use it as a communications tool, and you really do have to, there's nothing that is done or said now that is not captured somewhere. A good example of that is Mitt Romney's 47% comment. If you all remember that during the campaign, he was taped at a fundraiser, basically writing off 47% of the country. They're not going to vote for me anyway. We don't need to worry about them. 47%. And somebody taped that at the fundraiser, put it on YouTube, and it just exploded. And there was no way for him to backtrack that. He couldn't explain it. And it stayed with him, and it impacted the election significantly. The first debate broke the storyline, but people never forgot that 47% comment. Yeah. So that's a good example of, no matter where you are, what you're saying, someone is always recording it and putting it on the internet, and it is in the purest sense of the word, the democratization of politics. Everything is out there for the public forum.
But Omar, would you say that in India you could truly measure public opinion? As Stephanie is saying, when even as the debate was not over, the trend on Twitter gave a sense of how people were reacting. The problem with transplanting that model to India is that actually often those who are the loudest, sometimes they might be ideologically organized online, they're the ones who are driving the trends. So here, I do not know yet if something like Twitter can be used as a dipstick for public opinion. Take your state, for example.
It absolutely cannot.
It cannot.
It cannot.
Because?
With internet penetration the way it is, as low as it is, and the fact that as of now, the majority of your occupants on social media space are not the ones who queue up to vote. You cannot use what is trending on Twitter or what is being liked on a Facebook page as an accurate indicator of what people are thinking. For us in the social media space in politics today, it supplements and complements what we're doing, but it can't replace it. I can't use Twitter to gauge how people in Kashmir react to a particular story. I can use it to try and get a point of view across. As Shashi rightly pointed out, I can use it to engage a few people. Again, my ability to engage people is proportional to the amount of abuse I'm getting on my timeline. Yeah. Because clearly, and the more
we all deal
abusive
with
people are, the less likely I am to sift through timelines and look for meaningful feedback. But we're nowhere near the sort of thing that Stephanie's talking about.
How do you deal, for example, with what happened in the online space after the execution of Afzal Guru? You had young boys in the valley actually making their photographs of Afzal Guru. This happened on Facebook, this happened on Twitter. There are any number of boys from the valley who have, in solidarity with this man convicted in the Parliament attack case, made that their photograph. They're making a statement through that. There is a very organized and expressive separatist sentiment online. Now, in the offline world, you're grappling with this. In the online world, it gets amplified. So how do you deal with amplification of such a volatile subject?
It's actually very tricky. It creates a huge problem for us in that fine line between free speech and something that can be hugely problematic. I was listening to the interview that Eric Schmidt gave to NDTV yesterday, where he said that the answer to bad information is more information. Yeah. Now, the problem I have with that is that by the time I organize the more information to counter the bad information has already spread so far and so wide. Yeah. And in a state like Jammu and Kashmir, where society can be incredibly volatile, I could perhaps already have people dead on account of that bad information. So where do I draw the line as Chief Minister between allowing free speech and then being responsible to moderate that speech so that it doesn't get misused? The aftermath of the Afzal Guru execution is a classic example. No sooner had he been executed that we started seeing rumors being floated on social media that his mother had died of shock. Yeah. And you had people coming out wanting to protest the death of his mother, which hadn't happened. Yeah. So we then had to swing in, start asking service providers like Google and others to block sites, block off videos and things like that. It's not an easy call to make. Or for somebody who uses social media to get the message across, to then turn around and try and stop social media is actually incredibly difficult. And then it does open oneself up to criticism of hypocrisy. I mean, people come around and ask me, say, look, you use social media, and then when it cocomes to other people using it, you put a block on it. Yeah. The only thing is that I hope that the stuff I say on social media won't get people killed, for example, as opposed to others.
For example, if you could clarify this, there was, in the aftermath of this execution and these rumors floating around, sections of the valley where internet services were blocked. Is that correct?
They weren't blocked. Bandwidth was a little slower. Sorry. I mean, we split hairs. So you still had access to the internet on mobile platforms. Yeah. It was just a little tougher it was just a little tougher for you to upload or download videos on YouTube.
Why did you feel the need to do that?
The problem with this is that I've lived the repercussions of ill-advised use of, let's say, YouTube. In 2010, we had a pastor in the US who loaded a video of the Holy Quran being burnt.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, whether that was true or not, whether he actually burnt the Quran or not, nobody waited to see. But I had protests on the street, and on that day, I had, I think, about 16 deaths on account of security forces trying to quell the mob. So I really can't afford to sit back and wait for somebody to correct misinformation that is going around, because the speed with which rumors spread on social media, I mean, has to be seen to be believed. So I don't have a problem with youngsters who put Afzal Guru's picture as their display picture or something like that, because all you're doing is seeing what sentiment anyway exists on the ground.
Yeah.
It's the problem arises when you try and use this social media for rumors and to create trouble, to foment trouble, to provoke crowds.
Speak to that, Stephanie, because there was a particular film that actually some said initially led to the attack on the Americans in Benghazi, in Libya. And then later it turned out to be a much more complex narrative, and the film was not seen to be the cause, the causal effect. But at that time, once again, even in the United States, where the First Amendment protects free speech, you had this huge raging debate. What do you do when you have an image of a pastor burning the Holy Quran? While that may not have a ripple effect in the United States of America, it could have one in Afghanistan, where there are American troops, for example.
Absolutely. Well, the First Amendment in the United States is obviously critically important to who we are, but it's not infinite. And when, and this is tested all the time because of the open mediums as a result of the internet, where if safety or danger or lives are at stake, there is a limit to it, and it's up to a balance, people finding a balance between open debate and dangerous debate, and that's a great example of it. And for something that happens in the United States that's inciting violence elsewhere, it's something that we have to deal with. So that balance between regulation and open speech is something that has to be, it's a constant evolution in finding that right balance. Some of it is circumstantial, case by case, but it's something that we're always trying to seek. Certainly that particular incident was a terrible tragedy, and it's still being investigated. But that probably was the biggest wake-up call in the near term, in the recent past, of what can happen when people are using it irresponsibly.
But Shashi,
these two are actually very good examples of why we shouldn't be complacent about that 12% penetration rate. Because in fact, as in the case that Omar mentioned, and in the case that Stephanie mentioned, it's enough for those 12% to see it, for them to inflame the remaining 88%. And that is the danger. Remember what happened to the Northeasterners, right? You had all these manufactured, maliciously doctored photographs of alleged Northeasterners' atrocities on Muslims. I mean, sometimes the pictures were actually faked by, frankly, sites largely based in Pakistan. These sites went viral. And then what happened was that lots of people who are not themselves on the internet were sufficiently angered by this, by other people beating the tom-toms on this, that they then started sending these threatening SMSs and threatening phone calls that caused Northeasterners to flee their homes and escape what they thought was sure retribution for alleged crimes of other Northeast.
However, what you also saw in the aftermath of what happened in the Northeast, some would say, is the misuse of Section 66A. There were people rounded up who actually had nothing to do with it. There were journalists on that list whose user handles were blocked through some servers. And there has been a growing controversy ever since then of the misuse of what most of us widely believe is a draconian section. Now, the internet, Shashi, would you say, is it not enough for the internet to come under the ambit of the law of the land? Why do you need a separate section to control it?
Well, not my ministry, so I've got to, I've got to say that I can't really speak to it. I'm not a huge fan of 66A myself. Discussed it with Kapil Sibal in my time. I would say that every country has an Information Communications Technology Act. And as Kapil points out, the language of our Act actually mirrors the language of the UK Act, and other countries have similar language. To my mind, what we've discovered, I think, through the practice of democracy and freedom of expression in our society, is that it's not so much the language of the law that matters as the way in which it is applied.
But the language is ambiguous enough that it gives
often is, you know, for
an
example,
opportunity to the cops to misuse.
For example, we don't have absolute freedom of expression in our constitution, as the Americans do. So ours is circumscribed for a number of factors, including something as vague as friendly relations with foreign countries, which in theory would make all criticism of Indian foreign policy illegal and unconstitutional. But in fact, in practice, no one has interpreted it that way. Nobody has been prosecuted for criticizing the government's foreign policy. And similarly, we had hoped, I think, in passing this law, that sensible authorities and sensible judges would interpret these somewhat amorphous provisions in a way that erred more on the side of freedom of expression and less on the side of clamping down.
But personally, would you like to see 66A go, personally?
Well, as a member of the government, I'm not really at liberty to express a personal opinion on that. But let me say that obviously it is not healthy for a couple of junior sub-inspectors and less to feel they can arrest somebody for a Facebook post. When you think of some of the previous episodes of controversial bannings in our country of books and so on, it went up to the highest levels of the government to take that decision. And so it's very important to ensure, I think, that first of all, the authorities are conscious what the law means, are educated in how to apply it, and there are sufficient checks and balances so it can't be misused. After that, it's up to Parliament whether it wishes to repeal that section or not.
Omar, would you have it repealed? 66A?
What about, do I have an opinion on it?
Do you have an opinion on it? Because you have an opinion that you don't want to express, or?
No, because I haven't really formed an opinion on it.
Okay, the criticism could be, the criticism of our political establishment, not of any of you in particular, could be that actually politicians, and this could be a criticism even of mainstream media, that people have not learned to deal with what happens once you try and block something or complain about something, however legitimate that may be, and all of us have objected at different times, I certainly have, to something that is evidently defamatory or evidently slanderous. In the beginning, it can really hurt, it can really offend. But do you find that one of the things on the internet is this, to me I don't understand, is this philosophy that the big guy is always wrong? Even if the big guy, so it could be big media, it could be the politician, it could be whoever, but in the online narrative, the big guy is always wrong, however inflammatory, defamatory, slanderous the comments of the so-called small guy, which is the microblogger, may have been.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the more famous person, whether business, politics, media, etc., is always the one who is wrong. There are no two ways about this. I mean, if you were to check, I mean, I keep going back to my timeline, but if you were to check my timeline, depending upon whether the person is from the rest of India or from Kashmir, I'm either not Indian enough or not Kashmiri enough at the same time.
Yeah.
On the same issue.
On the same issue.
Yeah.
On exactly the same issue. I'm not Indian enough and I'm not Kashmiri enough. And I can't for the world of me figure out how I fall through this crack. But I obviously do. And nothing I can do can correct that narrative. See, the problem with social media, I mean, I guess it's the advantage and the disadvantage, is that the anonymity that it affords you allows people to feel that they can get away with saying absolutely anything. So, I mean, it's amazing that journalists who use it can be so slanderous on Twitter, but wouldn't have the guts to say the same thing on the, in the television channel that they're working for. And I can point out numerous examples of well-known media personalities who feel they can get away with saying damn near anything on Twitter, but wouldn't have the guts to say the same thing on air because I think courts would take cognizance of what they've said on air rather than what they've said on Twitter. So, I mean, how do you deal with that? There are no easy answers to it.
Stephanie, as a political manager or campaign manager, how do you deal with the fact that ideology can actually be, especially in a country like the United States of America, where social media really is an instrument of electoral campaigning, unlike here where it's just getting there, it's very nascent. The fact that opinion can be politically organized. It can be politically organized on the side of the Democrats, on the side of the Republicans. How do you sift through politically affiliated opinions on either side of the divide to gauge the public mood?
Well, I will say this, that about 8 years ago, we faced the same thing, where the fringes of the political parties were online and very vocal. Yeah. And their voices were overweighted compared to what average Americans were hearing and thinking and talking about. I think that's still partly true, but there are so many people online now that the conversations that are, the conversations are largely over, what time do I need to pick up my kid at the soccer game, or are we carpooling today, or did you check out this new recipe, or check these sports scores? It's part of regular discourse. That's how people share information, have conversations, connect with people. So now politics is fitting into that rather than the opposite of the American people fitting into the political discourse online. The political discourse online is just a small fragment of it. So in terms of how, as a campaign manager, we use that, there's the right and there's the left discourse. Yeah. And then there's this discourse in the middle. And how do we fit into that? Well, Facebook is a huge means for people to connect and have conversations, particularly for younger Americans and for women. So we knew we had to have a conversation through Facebook. And in the United States, the friends of Barack Obama on Facebook, it's 33 million people. And for every friend, they are friends with 98% of every American on Facebook. So if we could harness that and have a conversation with those Facebook users, and then they could have a conversation with their friends, we're reaching tens of millions of people. So, and those conversations weren't really political. They were very positive, because that's how people, average Americans, not the fringe on the left and the right, wanted to have conversations online. It was very factual, straightforward, easily obtainable information. And that, I think that was new in this past election of how we used the internet. Similarly, YouTube videos for younger Americans, great way to communicate. Those videos are all positive videos, just pure informational videos, things that we're fact-checking. Maybe something the Romney campaign was putting out on us, we'd use YouTube videos to just fact-check it. Positive information, factual information, and hundreds of millions of people downloaded those videos by the end of the campaign. So I've said the word evolution probably about 10 times through the course of this conversation, but it truly is an evolution in how people use the internet, how they get their information from the internet, and the types of conversations that we'll have. This is instructive, because this is exactly the conversation that we were having about 10 years ago. If everybody remembers Howard Dean, who was a Democratic candidate, some people thought that he was from the extreme left of the Democratic Party. In many ways he was. His candidacy wouldn't have been possible but for the internet. But what proved to be true is those that were supporting him and following him on the internet was such a small subsection of the voting public, he didn't win the Democratic nomination. Fast forward to today, Barack Obama, also a progressive candidate from the center left of the party, used the internet. Now people, the voting population is using the internet to find information, to organize themselves, to participate in elections, find out where their local voting polling station is to go vote, or figure out how to volunteer, or who else is supporting Barack Obama. Or I just heard something on TV that I want to make sure is actually true. I'm going to go to the internet and find out that information myself, and I'm going to share it with all my friends. Those are all of the different ways that the internet can help a campaign, but also help a citizen participate.
Shashi, some of those things require a critical mass we don't have here.
I was just going to ask you that.
Could not use the internet to organize. You can't organize a rally on the internet. You really will have to go out through more traditional means. I don't know. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I would agree, absolutely.
So we still aren't there, because that's where the 12%
But is it because our politics is also structured in a different way? Because American politics is much more centered around the individual.
That's true.
Right? And here you have a parliamentary democracy, which is much more complex in its structure. The electoral mathematics is that much more complex. So I'm wondering, given that, what is the relationship with the internet? And is that why the Congress has been somewhat slower to embrace this medium than the BJP, which has certainly been quicker to embrace technology?
Perhaps you're right. And when I had a web page during the last elections, I was told the only other politician who did was L.K. Advani. So perhaps you're right, the BJP was there in that space surprisingly early. Today, it's of course everybody's out there on the web. And one of the interesting uses that I found, and I tried consciously, by the way, to do this in my press conferences, was to encourage the press to look for material about my campaign on the web. So if they couldn't reach me Doesn't matter, the answers might be out there on my webpage. I'm certainly going to do that again in the next election, because my message is, this is actually a tool that you can use, and of course you will reach far more people than I will. But I still reiterate, we will not reach a majority of our voters through the internet. We will not be able to organize much of our campaign. It's not a fundraising tool, because our fundraising is very different from America. And finally, it's not in and of itself going to be a vehicle for, other than the three things I mentioned earlier, including the image building.
So it's ancillary?
It is an add-on. It is a complement to traditional forms of politicking, which we still all have to practice, particularly since all of us have constituencies in which there are rural elements, where there are poor people, there are people without access to conventional means of information. But I do stress, the impact of this can be in terms of how it's replicated beyond the internet space. So things on social media, which are then used either by your critics or by your own campaigners to magnify your message, that can be useful. So I'm not at all, as I said, the 12% is not the whole story. But as a voting tool, that's about as far as we can go.
Irrelevant as a voting tool? Is it irrelevant as a voting tool?
As of now, yes. I mean, honestly, if I tried to organize a public rally using just social media, there would be me, there'd be my security detail, and probably a handful of television cameras. There wouldn't be a single voter present in the audience at that time. And that's a reality today. Maybe with internet penetration and smartphone usage increasing, perhaps a decade down the line, this conversation would be very different. But as of now, I mean, as Shashi said, it's an add-on. It's a supplement.
Let's compare it to the mobile use. We still don't, we have about 25 million smartphone users, but we have 900 million mobile phone users. Did the text message before there was internet ever become a way of organizing rallies or politically mobilizing people? Because if that did not, then nor will this.
You had the India Shines example, where Atal Bihari Vajpayee, as Prime Minister, called up almost every Indian on their mobile phones and made a request for votes. We know the result of that election. So, no, I mean, SMSs, none of us have used SMSs for electioneering beyond a point.
I've done so, Omar, in my constituency, but of course, between 2004 and 2009, probably the number of mobiles in people's hands also grew exponentially, as it has continued to since then. And I suspect that by the next election, we are going to be looking at a situation where the majority of our voters will have a mobile phone.
Well, and I think the majority of our voters will probably be extremely peeved if at 5 o'clock in the morning they get a call from Dr. Manmohan Singh asking for a vote. I think that's a surefire way.
No, it would be nice to hear him speak, so I would like that call.
Well, you may very well think that, but I don't think Shashi or I could possibly comment.
And not at 5 a.m. in any case. So. No, but also, you know, sending SMS messages has become more difficult now because of the various restrictions imposed on bulk messaging, for example. So there will be some limitations. But, you know, in the Arab Spring, the SMS was a far more effective tool of getting people to Tahrir Square than into the internet or social media. So it has potential.
But then here's the question, and I want to ask all three of you this. Stephanie, let me start with you. If it was not a voting tool, think of the time when it wasn't a voting tool. How do you persuade politicians that they need to be on this space? Because right now the skepticism in the Indian political establishment is that this is something that's a bit, that could be frivolous, because for a politician, anything that doesn't have an electoral impact eventually is a bit of a waste of time. Omar and Shashi don't think that, but I know many politicians who just don't want to get into it. They think it's messy, and they think that the gains are not enough.
Well, are you talking about text messaging?
Or no, anything, any use of technology.
Here's a good text messaging example of what happened in the United States. Politicians weren't using it, but other elements of our society were. For instance, there were, about 7 years ago, there were huge immigration rallies that took place all over the United States, pushing our politicians to change our immigration laws. It's something that President Bush was working on with Ted Kennedy at the time. And we have Latin DJs who have an enormous influence over the Hispanic population in the United States. And they figured out, working with some advocacy organizations, of how to organize these rallies simply by text messaging. And tens of thousands of people would show up at a march for immigration reform with 24 hours notice. So people like myself took note of that. And how do we harness that as campaigners, as politicians, to get people to show up in a similar fashion. In 2008, we used the immigration model to figure out how we could be text messaging and communicating with people on their mobiles to have them take action of some sort. And it worked. It didn't work at the scale of the immigration rallies, but it worked. This time, it became a primary means of communication. You know, other elements of society, as the internet use grows in India, we'll use this as either a mode of commerce, you know, organizing for young people, entertainment purposes, and just take note of that, because that's how people in their daily lives will get information or will organize themselves or make decisions for themselves. And look at how they're doing that, and then bring politics to it. Politics doesn't always need to lead this mode of communication, but you definitely have to pay attention to it, because that's how people will conduct their lives.
Let's look at the protests that happened after the rape in Delhi. The fact is that that was probably an example, because it wasn't about one constituency or one state with its complexities, but it was more city-oriented. So in that, you did see the internet being used to organize protests. But would you then say that the internet is still imprisoned by class in India, and that's why politicians yet don't take it seriously? Because in any case, politicians do not take the middle class as seriously as an electoral constituency as they take other socio-economic stratas.
Well, two things. First, you're right. It is a small class, and it's by Indian standards an elite class. But it's growing. The internet penetration has been growing every year. We'd had this conversation 2 years ago, it was 10%, right? Yeah. So it is growing. The second thing is, again, this replication effect, which is that if the mainstream media picks up what's happening on the internet space, you will magnify it, it'll have a larger impact. And similarly, if rabble-rousers were to pick up what's on them, they too can have an impact on the streets. And they do. And therefore, we simply cannot write it off. That doesn't mean that we can curb it. I think it's better to get into the game. I encourage other politicians to do so. I mean, I had the experience that the first guy who sticks his head above the parapet is always the one who takes the first few bullets. But I think, you know, we're many more heads now above the parapet, and I think that in due course, we will have more and more politicians seeing the positives and using it constructively.
Let me ask all of you briefly, what's the weirdest experience you've had online?
Oh, God. How much time do you have? Well, actually,
we're all ears.
No, well, actually, the strangest one for me was the sort of confusion within mainstream media about how to treat a politician who is active on social media. I mean, it's a different matter that the average sort of tweeter or twit or whatever it is you want to call them
would actually,
well, I'm a twit, so I have no problem with that. No, what I'm saying is that they would, I mean, I'm oftentimes asked, if you're on Twitter, when do you work? As if I'm supposed to put in 24 hours a day without a single break. It doesn't take long to type 140 characters. Exactly. So, I mean, let's be clear about that. But even the mainstream media
Are you pointing to Sunanda? She says you spend too much time there. Okay.
Even the mainstream media is a villain in this. I mean, a very well-known publication once had a cartoon of mine and called me a tweet-a-minute chief minister. Now, of all the things I want to be known for, that really wasn't one of them. So I backed off. I actually went silent for a couple of weeks. And a sister publication of the same group suddenly had a big article saying, where is Omar Abdullah and why is he quiet? So, I mean, both ways I can't win. Either I'm a tweet-a-minute chief minister or I've disappeared. So, I mean, even mainstream media needs to get used to politicians on social media.
I think mainstream media has its own anxieties about social media and doesn't know how to deal with it.
Oh, I'm sure.
I mean, that has to be honestly said. You don't know whether to use it as a source of information or as a source of people who might replace you. I mean, if
Absolutely.
Well, I don't think that's going to happen. You guys will evolve. I mean, yes. I mean, that is the word of the day. So I'll borrow that word and end on that. The same way we are evolving.
Yeah,
I
don't think any of us have a choice. I don't think any of us have a choice.
None of us do. No, I don't see as many politicians as perhaps we're talking about here getting onto social media. I mean, you can still name only a handful.
Yeah, that's
I mean, there are barely 3 or 4 of Shashi's colleagues, 1 or 2 chief ministers, and it's a really
major
small
opposition
group.
Leaders are on. There are more opposition leaders online right now.
There are, but there are at least 20 MPs in the Congress party I could name. So the numbers are growing. But I'll tell you, one of the things that has evolved is actually a bit regretful in the sense that early on it was still a playful medium. So we were all a little more
bantering
jokey, bantering a bit more.
Yeah.
I still remember a few months after Omar came on Twitter. I see the clock has stopped, so this won't be on television, Omar. And Omar tweeted, at midnight he tweeted, I'm looking at this box of chocolates and I'm just so tempted. So I sort of replied saying, Omar, go for it. You should always give in to temptation. Omar replied, thanks for the encouragement, Shashi. I'm going to do it. Now, obviously, my wife came down on me like a ton of bricks the next morning. Others did. Everyone said, how can you be so trivial? You're a minister. He's a chief minister, and you're talking about chocolates and milk. Well, the truth is, it was part of the fun that made Twitter interesting and that attracted followers to us. I mean, I'm guilty of being the first one 4 years ago to crack the Aam Aadmi joke. Describing how many mangoes I ate that day, said, you see, I am Aadmi.
It was more fun earlier. It was more fun. I used to be a lot more light-hearted on Twitter earlier than I am now. I'm very reluctant to be humorous or funny because it doesn't go down very well.
Well, let's just end with saying that maybe it's not as much fun because it's also taken more seriously now. It's also a statement of record. In that sense, the lines between traditional and new media are actually blurring. But I think it's great to have at least all of you who are online because it shows that you believe in communicating with people. And I think that really makes a difference to people who don't hear from their governments, who don't hear from their politicians. We'll have to end it there. Whether it's under 12% or not, under 12% in India is still 150 million people. It may or may not yet shape electoral politics, but it certainly shapes or is one element in shaping public narrative. Let's have a big round of applause for those of us who are online and it is talking directly to the people. Thank you.